Hello, listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker, Casey, and it is now officially less than 1 month until CrimeCon UK in London on June the 11th and 12th. If you are interested in coming along to the event and you have yet to buy your tickets for this immersive and packed full of content weekend, visit crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT for a 10% discount on your weekend ticket. Don't forget there's also CrimeCon coming up in September in Glasgow on the 10th. Today we are going to be revisiting a religious movement that has been explored on the show before, but from a fresh perspective. Please be advised that this episode does come with sensitive themes that include child abuse, labour trafficking and more. So please listen with discretion. To talk us through her experiences of growing up in the Children of God, here is Angela. So hello, Angela, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today about your experiences growing up in the Children of God. This is a topic that we have explored, but I am eager to gain your perspective and learn about your personal experiences. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name's Angela and I am second generation Children of God. I was born into the group in 1980 and I was there until 2000 when I left, so 21 years ago. So that was the first 20 years of my life. And I know you've spoken to ex-Children of God before and you've had a first generation, I think, and a third generation. So hopefully I can shed a bit of light on what it's like to be second generation.
Absolutely. And it's pretty recently that you've taken this leap in talking about your experiences. Was there any particular reason that triggered this decision?
Yeah, there was really. And I think when I first left the cult, I was the first of my family to leave. And so, they were really programmed you and, and they really told you that, terrible things would happen to you if you ever spoke about the group, and also terrible things would happen to your family. Like your brothers and sisters will be taken away and put in social services and all sorts of stories like that. So it's a really frightening thing to speak. And sometimes I talk about it as being like the last taboo to break. And my goal when I first left was really just to try and integrate into society. And I thought, if I can just learn, the British culture, if I can, meet the right friends, if I could study something, that I could just put it all behind me and just move on. But then what I found over time is that, the ripple effects of growing up in a cult, they don't just disappear, they keep on coming. And particularly around mental health issues, and there's a real problem around suicide with Children of God survivors. And, some of my family have made suicide attempts, and I have a sister with schizophrenia. So, the impact is ongoing. And some people that I grew up with as well, were successful in their suicide attempts. And I suppose during the pandemic as well, it makes you reflect on all these things, and mental health issues kind of come to the fore a bit more, and you become more aware of, I suppose, differences and difficulties going on in your family. And so it was this time last year that I was chatting with a good friend who's a social worker and saying, I'm really starting to feel like, I wish there was something I could do, but maybe not quite meaning it, but just sort of, how you put that out there, just, I wish I could do something. And she said, well, nobody ever talks about this stuff in social work. Why don't you just come and do a talk at my work? So I did. And then I got a couple more invites to do talks to social workers and mental health community teams. And then just through that, and just making connections, ended up getting invited onto a podcast. And then that's how you found me. So it has grown a little bit on its own. And I don't really know where it's going, but it feels like it does feel right to talk. And I think it's important to talk, particularly when people do feel really alone around mental health things, and in cults, you feel like you're the only one. So I think the more of us that talk about it, the better. I
think it's so amazing that it feels right for you to have these conversations, for you to speak out about it. It's often I speak to people and I say, why do you use the word survivor? And one person said to me, because I'm still here and a lot of people aren't. So I am a survivor and I have gone through these experiences and I'm still here, where some people, unfortunately, they aren't, whether that's through ill mental health and suicidal ideation and suicide completion. and or just through circumstances within these groups that we often hear about going covered up for decades sometimes. But it's great for me to hear that you've been approached by other people who have invited you to come and speak more and more and more, because a lot of the time in these stories there will be a sentence in an article or a documentary that said social services became involved or child protection services became involved and children were removed from the community or from the home or from the compound. Nobody really talks about what that looks like for a social worker, what that looks like for the professionals in that field. It's kind of just like a social worker's got involved. The training that must have to come with a kind of understanding that situation and the children that you might be working with and trying to understand the psychology behind the environments that those children have existed in is probably not something that's common to many social workers, and probably not something that they have had extensive training in specifically. So I imagine it's great for them to have you also come and speak to them about your experiences and the environment that you grew up in as well. And you're speaking to me with an English accent, and you said that you decided to embrace the English culture. So is England where you are based now?
It is. And I did spend a good chunk of my childhood in England, probably 11 years. And out of the first 13, after I was 13, I didn't live in England anymore. But that's not the story of my accent. That's a different story. And that's that in the Children of God, we all have what we would call the family accent. So the Children of God now call themselves the Family International. And by the time I was born in, the name had changed to the Family of Love. And so what that was because we grew up in communes, and it tended to be international. People within the commune. So it's an American group. So there was lots of Americans, and then you'd have a few British people, you'd have some people from the mainland Europe, and all coming together and all raising the children together. And so our accents would be like a hybrid mixture of mainly sort of English American weird. It can only be described as a family accent. But it was after I left, and I was so scared of telling anybody that I'd been in a cult, and every single person I met asked me, where are you from? Like, what is that accent? Where are you from? And I just thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to do something about this. So within weeks, I was trying to blend my accent in to try and get an English accent. But I can still hear when I hear myself back, and sometimes I do interviews with other people and I have to listen to myself back on tape, and I can hear where I make mistakes in the accent, and where I just, the intonation, the Americans go up where we sometimes go down, and I don't always get it right. So
there's such a complicated question for you to answer as well. Where are you from? That in itself is probably like, how do I answer that question? I am from a lot of places. Do you speak about that from a religious upbringing perspective, like a physically where you're based at certain points in your time perspective? That in itself is quite a difficult question to answer. But you were born in England and you stayed here until you were 13.
Yeah, pretty much. There was a couple of times when we lived abroad during that time, but for the most part, I was born in Yorkshire, and for the most part we lived here.
And did you live on one of these communes that the Children of God are quite infamous for existing in?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what it was.
Whereabouts in the country was that or other particular communes? Where did they exist? Because I've never heard of one being close to me, and I've lived in the southeast and the northwest.
Well, so the Children of God had a really good, strong presence in the UK. And so it's an American group, and probably within a couple of years, within the first 5 years, definitely, of it being founded, they spread out from America and came over to Europe, and England was one of the first places they came. And so it was Kent and London were the beginnings. And so by the time I was born, so this is, we're talking about like maybe 6 or 7 years before I was born. So by the time I was born, they were all over. So, off the top of my head, I can think, I've said Kent and London, but also I can think like Oxford, Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, obviously Yorkshire, because I was born there, places in Herefordshire, and then obviously lots of places in Scotland as well. So it was literally the spread out through the entire UK.
Wow.
And when you never lived anywhere for more than like 1 to 2 years. So either you'd be moved to another commune, or the whole or you'd be pioneering a new city, or the whole commune would move somewhere. So because of that, you kind of got a sense of, because people around you were moving, and you would ask them, well, where did you come from, or where are you going? And so you would kind of build up a bit of a picture about what cities. You wouldn't know them all because they were so secretive about where the locations were of their communes, but you would kind of build some picture of where things were. But then also on top of that, we used to raise money and recruit people through outreach. So within a 2-hour radius of any commune, pretty much you would hit, that's what we would call it, you would hit pretty much every city or town within that 2-hour radius, because you'd go out there on the streets selling your literature or your videos or your cassettes, whatever the cult had produced. And you didn't want to keep going back to the same city, because if you're in the city centre, it's quite often the same people coming out on their lunch breaks, and you don't want to just ask the same people all the time. So you'd go to different cities as much as you could. And then on top of that, you would have road trips where you could reach even further by staying somewhere else for a few days in a city where there isn't a commune, and then you could hit all the areas around there. So I would say, at a good guess, I would say it wouldn't surprise me if all the major cities and towns in England had, at least somebody on the street talking to people at some point.
That is fascinating to me, because after reading Mary Mahoney's book and really kind of picturing the circumstances in which these communes existed when she was a part of the movement over in Japan, and the masses of people that they had living in these buildings, I just feel like that's something that people would be aware of. But I suppose by the 1980s to 2000s, when you were involved in the group, things might have changed significantly, especially in terms of name changes because of scandals and journal articles being released and exposés, and so kind of the big rebrand happens over and over. So I suppose it's like a well-oiled machine that just adapts and learns how to stop drawing attention to the things that people are looking out for, like lots of people living in one building perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. And we were really security conscious by this time, and it is deceptive, this organization, and they will go by other names. And so when you're on the street, and even if somebody comes up to you and says, "Are you children of God?" flat out deny it and just say, "No, that organization was disbanded. They don't exist anymore. We're the family of love, or we're Heaven's Magic, or whatever." And quite often, like the communes, you choose your own fake name that nobody else is using as just something that you guys came up with.
Is this what are you coached to give these responses as children as well when you're selling propaganda on the streets?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And it's justified with this idea of deceivers yet true. So this publication came out, and it went through all these stories in the Bible where, people had to be maybe less than honest or do something that was maybe slightly immoral. And that's to show you that, if it's for Jesus and it's for God, sometimes you have to do things that, are hard or difficult, or that you feel are wrong. So you absolutely should not lie to the adults within the cult. But if it's an outsider saying to you, why aren't you in school, or, what's going on here, then, you need to give the message that you were coached with. And that was, it became a real problem later on, because when people did try to get involved and, rescue kids who were going through abuse or different situations, we were so well coached in what answers we were supposed to give that, when the authorities or social workers asked us, are you okay? Are you happy? Whatever it was, people just said whatever they were coached to say, because we were so frightened as well. The fear was there, and we were told lots of stories about what would happen to us if we were taken into social services, and, all these different things that would happen. And so, you absolutely can teach children to hide the truth. And that's what, I think probably wasn't realised at that time.
it's not just coaching individuals in the group on reasons why you shouldn't speak to outsiders because of secular influence, because you may stray from the group. It's actually a means of ensuring that the abuse going on inside the group stays contained, that information stays contained within the group. So it's more than just trying to stop people from leaving the children of God. It's more than just creating a dependency level and very intrinsic control methods being used to keep people within the movement, to keep generating money to go out and pioneer and evangelize and sell propaganda. It's more than just kind of a business. It's to make sure that abuse that has been highlighted so much in the media, but still not enough really. It's more to make sure that stays hidden.
Yeah, I would call it a security measure. That's how I would describe it.
Oh, and you're just children as well.
Absolutely.
And so one of my questions was going to be, had you visited a number of different communes in England by the time you left at age 13? So your answer has already been that you'd actually been to a fair few different communes.
Yeah, that's right. And there was something I did want to say about that, really, is something I've probably only realized recently, that one of the things that kind of gives me chills about it is sometimes things like the constant moving, it doesn't feel like abuse, and it doesn't feel like, I'm not traumatized by that, at least on a conscious level. So, you could say that children need stability, or, so there might be something subconscious going on there. But on a conscious level, I'm absolutely fine with it. It doesn't bother me at all. But when you kind of think about their intentions behind why they did it and the kind of the impact that it had, is that you're constantly in this destabilization. If you never live anywhere for more than 1 to 2 years, and sometimes within that period of time, your whole commune might have to move to a different house, even if you're still within the same commune. And in that period as well, other people around you will be coming and going. You've always got this kind of movement of people. And I think it's kind of destabilizing. And, you can't stop and think, some weird publications come out, or I'm not really sure, Berg's had a weird dream. You don't really have time to really stop and think about that properly when you're like, I'm responsible for moving this commune from one place to another, and we're struggling to find a house. And, like, you have real practical concerns. But then there's another side to it as well, which is that, it's people did make friendships within the group, but it must be hard to find somebody that you can really trust if you've got doubts to talk to. And it probably takes a certain amount of time to build that up with somebody, but it's hard if you're not living with anybody for very long. And if you do find someone and you can trust them and talk about these things, they're probably one of you, you're going to get separated, before too long. So I think those things are really important to talk about.
Absolutely. I can imagine that constant state of flux is very exhausting physically and emotionally and mentally as well, especially, as you said, if you're responsible for people within that commune, if you're a parent, which of course many of the families were and encouraged to be big families, and no access to birth control and the flirty fishing that we've discussed with Mary at length as well, in terms of going out and being whores for Jesus, as written in the Mo letter that Berg released, meant that there were lots of babies and children growing up in the children of God. So to be responsible for moving those children around all of the time and being in that constant state of transition, it as you said, it must just be a way to stop people from feeling settled and relaxed, and give them a minute to just be like, oh my goodness, we're here, we've moved, we've unpacked everything. Some people probably just stopped unpacking. I remember Mary said she had that one suitcase and it just had all her stuff in all the time.
Oh yeah, we lived out of a suitcase all the time. Yeah.
Even when you're just waiting for the housing company to sign, or the solicitors to sign all the paperwork so that you can get the keys to your house, or all the stuff that comes with trying to purchase a property in England, that feels like a state of flux. Being pregnant for 9 months, you're like, okay, I know this big event is happening, but it's kind of like you have to wait 9 months to get there. So that is like one of those periods of like, I know a big event is happening and I can't really relax until it happens. And then it happens and you're like, okay, well, now there's a newborn, so now there's all this other stuff to worry about. So it being, as you said, not able to make even real deep personal friendships and connections with people because you don't know if they're going to leave next week, you don't know if you're going to have to leave next week. The people that were going out to do the flirty fishing or the FFing, if they met somebody who they connected with, who was able to speak to them in a way that might start to encourage their free thinking or their doubts, they might not get a chance to carry on that relationship or that agreement because they're off next week somewhere else in the country flirty fishing in another part of the world even. So I just can't imagine as a child that level of upheaval all the time. And as you said, it's just not something that phases you because you were so used to it. But even that in a statement in itself is kind of, for you to say that doesn't bother you because you were so used to it is kind of problematic in itself, because I don't think that is something any child should just be like, well, that's my life. After you left England at 13, what other countries did you visit? Was there sort of one other place you settled down, or was it a number of different locations?
Yeah, so if we want to talk about international travel, the first time we lived abroad, was when I was really, really little. And we lived in Switzerland for 3 months. And my dad actually got kicked out of the country because he was caught, selling cult literature on the street. And so we ended up having to go, I think we had something like 48 hours or something to leave the country. And so we ended up going to Holland for a couple of weeks and then back to the UK. So that was like one attempt. And then in 1983, we moved to India. Berg had sent out some, prophecies and messaging saying that everybody needed to kind of go over to, Asia, and, we needed to spread out and escape the destruction. And I think he was predicting like nuclear war and different things in the West. So he was telling everybody to go over to Asia. So we went, but we didn't make it very long there either, because my parents got hepatitis and I got really sick too. And I don't remember, but my mum tells me that I just refused to drink. And when you're living in India and you refuse to drink, that's quite, that was quite scary, I think, for her. So we made it for 6 months and then we came back, and then we tried again in 1988. But we only lasted another 6 months in India because the laws had changed around immigration in India. So everybody out there was leaving India and it wasn't possible to stay longer. So that was kind of our early attempts at living abroad. And so when I was 13, so we're fast forwarding to 1993, we moved to Ireland, but that was to do mainly, I think, with the British court case. I don't know if anyone's discussed that with you.
No.
But no. So there was a British court case. So this was in London, and there was a grandmother who she wanted to get her grandson out of the Children of God. So he would have been second generation. And, this all went to family court. And the judge really looked at everything from every different angle. And, people from, kind of Berg's top people came in to give statements, and he interviewed lots of ex-members, and all sorts of people got involved. And, the Children of God, they were really worried that they were going to lose this court case. And so I think near enough the time when they were expecting the judgment to be released, I don't know how many people they moved out of England, but they started to move at least some people out of England, and we were one of the families that they moved out. So we ended up in Ireland for a couple of years. And then in 1996, we moved to Eastern Europe. And I was there until I left the cult in 2000.
Wow, so much moving around, not just domestically, but internationally as well.
Yeah, I've tried to count, and I think at least 26 houses in 20 years.
Oh.
But the conversation that came up when we were discussing this is, what do you count as a house? Because, you know, like when I said in Holland, we only lived there for 2 weeks. Does that count or not count? Because we weren't living anywhere else. But if I went somewhere for 2 weeks now, I would call that a holiday, not a move. You know what I mean? So it's like, so it gets like, it's a weird thing.
It is. But if you're taking your possessions with the intention of staying there, I would class that as a move. So that's wild. That's like more than one move a year.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that sounds exhausting, just doing the maths on paper.
Yeah. And when I think about, you know, what our parents' generation were living through, you know, also having a baby every 2 years and, you know, a newborn baby, that's sleep deprivation right there. And, you know, a full schedule as well. You know, they scheduled every minute of your day from the, you know, you get up at sort of 6:37 and every minute's scheduled until like 10 o'clock at night when they're like, yeah, you can go to bed now. So it's, you know, it's relentless, and all this kind of, destabilizing environment, constantly moving. And often if they told you you needed to move to a new commune, they didn't just hand out the money to you. They said, you got to go and fundraise for that, you know? So it's, so it's no wonder that, you know, people always wonder why it's hard for people to get out, but it's really hard to stop and think, I think, you know, for people when you're in that environment.
So I realised that some people listening to this episode might not have listened to the other coverage that we've done or be aware of the history of the Children of God. And we've talked about Berg a little bit, so people might not know who it is that we're addressing. So maybe it might be worth me asking if you could give the listeners a sort of brief history of the Children of God, its leadership, the changes in leadership and where it stands today.
Yeah, sure. So the story really starts in 1919, which is the year that David Berg is born. And so, as you know, that's, you know, shortly after World War I, and he's born around the time of the Spanish flu. So really he's maybe a pandemic baby. I don't know if it started just after or what, but he definitely, I remember reading that him and his mum both got the Spanish flu and that they were really, really sick, but that they pulled through. And so I think until he was around 7, I think he lived in California, and then they ended up moving to Florida. And his mum is a really famous preacher in her own right. And she had this story like deathbed to pulpit overnight. So she's got this story about how she'd broken her back and, you know, she's lying there and then she prays and she tells God, you know, if you heal me, then I will, you know, spend my life serving you. And then, of course, you know, she's miraculously by the next day recovered and she's on her feet and she's got this ministry. And they used to take this big tabernacle, it was called. And so that's just basically means a massive tent. And you could get like thousands of people in there, like I think even like 6,000 or 7,000 people in there. And she would go around the country preaching. So this is kind of the environment that David Berg, the founder of the Children of God, grew up in. So he obviously was listening to people who were great speakers and, you know, charismatic people. And he met some of the big names, you know, on the speaking circuit of the day, people like Amy Temple McPherson, who was a really famous child speaker back then. And then I think there was, you know, a few traumatic things that happened to him as well that maybe shaped who he was. One was that he was sexually abused as a toddler. But he kind of rationalized that in his own mind because his mum caught this lady in the act and threw her out of the house, you know, screaming and, you know, really angry. And so he was really upset to see her go. So he kind of rationalized this stuff in his own mind and, you know, said she shouldn't have gone and he enjoyed it and, you know, he didn't see anything wrong with it. But obviously this is the mind of somebody who's, you know, been sexually abused and, you know, is trying to deal with it in their own way. So I think that's something that is important because obviously later on he's messed up around sex and, you know, you could probably trace some of that back to his early experiences. And then he has other experiences as well of, you know, his mum really shaming him around sex and threatening to cut off his penis because he's caught masturbating. So like, you know, he has got some kind of trauma going on in his early life. And then as he gets older and he leaves school, he becomes his mum's chauffeur and he helps her on her ministry. So she always felt like he was really special and made him feel special. And so he's learning from her. And eventually he gets to the point where he wants to have his own ministry, and he wants to be a preacher in his own right. And I think he does try. And at one point he has a church in Arizona, and he doesn't have it for very long, though, before he's kicked out of the church by the elders. And the official story, if you go to the Family International's website, is that he was really open-minded and broad-minded, and he wanted to include the American Indians into the church and welcome them with open arms. And the church leaders didn't like it and threw him out. There are other people making allegations saying that there was some sexual impropriety going on, and he was thrown out for that. And given what happened to him later on, that's quite likely. So I think a lot of his ideas around being anti-church, because his message, when he founds the Children of God, it's really anti-church, it's anti-establishment, but also at the same time he's still taking on the ideas of the church, because he's still preaching in salvation and apocalyptic doctrines, and this kind of evangelical stuff is coming through. So that's coming from the church that he'd grown up in himself, which was the Christian and Missionary Alliance. So he's kind of taking that on, but then also mixing it with, I guess, his personal reactions, to things that he's been through. So after he's there, I know that he does a few different jobs around, and he ends up his mum calls him to California and says, there's a lot of hippie kids here on the beach and they're struggling, and they need Jesus, and I think you should be over here as part of your ministry, to win them to the Lord. And he does go over there, and I know he gets involved at one point with a guy called Fred Jordan, who set up the American Soul Clinic, and they do a lot of work together. And he's out on the beaches and he's preaching, and he stops dressing in his suits and his ties, and he starts, long beard and kind of hippie clothes, and he's like a 60-year-old, and so he's out there with these young people who are, I don't know what they are, 17, 18, 19, and he's talking to them. And by this stage he's got 4 kids, I think, with his first wife, and so he really uses them as well, to go out and witness, and to try and bring these kids in. And it works. This time it really works. And I think Fred Jordan is the guy who gives him a big ranch. So I think people start wanting to move in with him. They kind of want to be around him. And eventually this guy, Fred Jordan, gives them this big ranch called the Texas Soul Clinic. That's what they call it. And they are able to found a really massive commune there. And so, like, your listeners who are familiar with other groups, like if you're thinking like Waco or Jonestown, how they have these like big compounds, I think it's something, not a million miles away from that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, even Charles Manson, he was older than the young people that he was kind of recruiting, and then he ended up with Sparns Ranch, and he was the older leader there of a group of hippie-ish young people as well, and he was dressing with the long clothes and the long beard and the long hair. So even the parallels there are quite striking.
Absolutely. And I think there are quite a few of these groups around as well. And he kind of teams up with some of them, and some of them, I think, lose a chunk of their followers to him as well. So it's all like, the history at this point for me sometimes feels a little confusing because of these, because it's like there's so many of them out there all doing this. There's the Jesus freaks, and they were initially called, I think, Teens for Christ, and there's lots of them going on. So I mean, it officially founds as a group, I think, in 1968, over 1968, 1969.
Which is exactly when Charles Manson was at Sparns Ranch. So that's strange.
Exactly. And, the message is great for the times, isn't it? Because everybody's thinking about, they're protesting the Vietnam War. It's all flower power. Suddenly, for the first time, there's contraception that, people can trust and that they feel like it works. And
yep, absolutely.
You're in a stable position because, the parents' generation were the war babies. And now finally there's some kind of, financial stability, and and people can kind of kick off and be angry with their parents because you can afford to, because, there's nothing, so bad happening in the world that you can't, you're not at war, or, you're not in the army or whatever. So people can do those things. And so he kind of really taps into, the feelings and the emotions of the day, and that's what he does well. And that's what seems to work for him. And they're, in the early days, they're really out there. They were into the sackcloth and ashes, and so they would put on, like, I don't know, is sackcloth something that people would know now? They know, yeah. Sometimes, like, when you talk about cult stuff, you're like, am I slipping into cult speak? Do people know what these words are?
Well, you might be. I mean, there's like 200 or so of these episodes now, so I start to kind of question what I knew before and what I know now. So maybe.
Because it's like cult speak. I think every cult has got its own dialect,
Absolutely, yeah.
So you have to be careful to make sure people understand. So sackcloth, and then they would cover themselves in ashes and have a big stick and, billboards around their necks saying, the end is nigh, and all that kind of stuff, and go on marches. And so they're really, really visible and, really drawing attention. And so there comes a point when, they're making the headlines for this, and they're not making the headlines for the sex stuff, because in the really early days, he was still carrying on with this, I guess, like the message that the traditional church would have, which is, a really conservative message around sex. So actually in the early days, it wasn't free love, and people couldn't take drugs and people couldn't drink. It was, it was fairly straight-laced with that, but they were making headlines for, for the other stuff that was going on, and for the fact that kids were just joining and dropping out. And there was a guy called Ted Patrick whose kid joined, and he found some other people, other parents who were going through the same thing, because, as well, they discouraged you from keeping contact with your parents when you joined. And, he founded FreeCog, which was Free the Children of God. And so they were like literally, kidnapping people and taking them out of the group and to deprogram them, to try and rescue them that way. And so I think there was a few things going on. And then, strangely enough, Berg, of course, gets a prophecy saying it's time to leave, it's time to leave America. And so it's not a huge amount of time from the time that it's founded. If you think it's founded in like 68, 69, I think by 72, 73, they're already branching out into Europe. And so definitely they came to Kent and set up communes there. And from there, they spread out through all of England, and then they started to, pioneer the world. And at one point he wanted to set up a commune in Israel because, he was quite, pro-Israeli and interested in that side of things. But then when he got there, he'd only been there a short while when they don't welcome him with open arms. And he's only there for a short while when he gets this vision, which is of all the people there walking around with horns on their heads. And then after that, he completely changes. And then he starts to publish really, really anti-Semitic doctrines. And he starts to say that the Jews are part of the conspiracy that's going to bring the Antichrist to power. And, the Jews are, kind of out to get us, and a lot more stuff, which I can't say here comfortably because it's full-blown hate speak. But, I think it's important to kind of call them out on, where there is racism that was in the group. And the same with, people of color. There was really, really racist messaging to those groups of people as well. The one group that didn't get it was Asians. He loved Asian people. So I don't know why. But, I think it's important to, if we're talking about this, it's,
And I think that speaks as well to Berg's rapid change in rhetoric and the belief systems that he was trying to teach or put onto others. Because one minute he thinks that the children of God should exist in Israel. And as soon as he's not accepted, his complete ideology around that nation changes, and then this hate speech comes out, and he's preaching, we might live in an age of contraceptive or access to birth control, and feminism might be on the rise, but we still expect women to wear the long skirts and cover themselves and keep their hair long and maintain purity culture. We don't condone sex within this group. There should be no sex before marriage. Sex should be only between a married man and wife. And as you said, kind of keeps to those more conservative rules and restrictions that are common to not just Christianity, but a lot of mainstream belief systems in throughout the world. But then, of course, flips that ideology and belief system around and changes that as well. So just that short mention in there of Berg's perceptions of certain ethnicities and nationalities and how that changes is important to highlight, because it's so in keeping with his character throughout the years and the shifts and changes that just seem to happen with him. But when does that second big shift happen? Do you remember that personally happening, where the Mo letters would change? Well, first of all, it's probably important to mention that David Berg started to be nicknamed Moses, so people would call him Moses, and so he would release these letters called Mo letters. So they were just written by David Berg, and they were just distributed amongst all the communes around the world, and would basically just contain whatever new ramblings he had come up with, or visions that he'd had, or new instructions for communes to adopt and undertake throughout the world. You could probably articulate it a lot better than I can.
Yeah, no, totally. And so around that time as well is when he removed himself from the communes. And so I didn't know what he looked like until he died, So he removed himself from the communes, and he decided he was only going to communicate by letter. And so this is why the publications were called the Mo letters, because he'd kind of taken on the name of, he felt like he was somehow like maybe a spiritual descendant of Moses and King David from the Bible. And, I think his mum and someone else had got a prophecies for him saying how special and important he was, and, some Bible chapters, which kind of fed into that as well. But they used to draw a picture of a lion over his face. So they would, sometimes there would be photos of him where there would always be a picture drawn over him. And then in any comics or cartoons or anything like that, you wouldn't know what he looked like. He was always a lion. But, also he was an alcoholic. So, these insane ramblings and his dreams and constantly having visions, some of them are just the ramblings of an alcoholic.
Do you remember your reaction when you saw his face for the first time?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So it was after he died. I think they kept it quiet for about 6 months after he died. We didn't know. And then they did a big reveal, and they sent out all these videos, which he'd recorded during his lifetime, the Garden of Eden series. And he'd, was singing and preaching and different things. And that was the first time that we were allowed to see what he looked like. And it was a shock. The whole thing was just a shock. Like, didn't know he died. He didn't know what he looked like. And now we can see him. And yeah, the whole thing was just, it just kind of took your breath away.
Because of the status that Berg held within the children of God, and the amount of power that he had in terms of making decisions around who lived where, and giving so much responsibility and power to other members within the children of God as well, within the faith's hierarchy that exists, or existed at least when David Berg was alive, and the organization was still called the Children of God. I don't know too much about it under a matriarchal leadership as the Family International, but what did you picture him to look like? Did you have like an idea in your head? Is it like when you're reading a book and you have an idea of what the character looks like, and then they do a motion picture of it and you're like, that's not anything like what I pictured the character looked like in the book as opposed to the film.
Absolutely, yeah. So I pictured, we knew he was old and that he had a beard. So you picture this really, healthy, lovely looking grandpa figure, because my generation, we had to call him grandpa. And so I was picturing, your dream grandpa, I guess that's kind of,
like maybe like Santa Claus.
yeah, a bit like Santa Claus, pretty old, but jolly and friendly and a big beard and whatever. But that's not what he looked like at all.
No, if anybody hasn't seen pictures of David Berg or isn't sure what he looks like, he's kind of like unkempt, kind of he is a bit crazy looking. I don't really like to use the word crazy, but he kind of just has like those wild eyes, really scraggly white hair in most of the the pictures that are public are more of him in his older years than of his younger years. A big, long, scraggly, unkempt white beard and just kind of like mangled teeth.
Yeah, just a bit overweight and yeah.
So he begins to release these Mo letters, and in one of these Mo letters contains the new prophecy that he has around trying to bring new people into the church, and the way to do that is for the women to go out and to bring men to God by basically through prostitution or sex work.
Yeah, that's right. And he does this with his wife in the first years. So you kind of picture him like in a bar or something, and and he's a pimp basically, and his wife's out there and she's being a prostitute, and then he's wondering why he's getting persecuted, but he's pimping out his wife. And from one of those encounters is Karen. So his wife is Karen Zerby, the current leader of the Children of God. And through one of those encounters, she has her first child, who was known in the group as Davidito. So he's born from flirty fishing, which is prostitution. And in the group, we called that, if that happened to you, you were a Jesus baby. So he starts off with his wife, and then he's tested it out, and it seems to be working pretty good. So he starts to roll this out, to the entire family. So I think with his wife, it was in the early 70s, but then it's sort of mid to late 70s when it's rolled out across the entire cult. And then around this period as well is when he starts to release other things about sex. And he tells his personal stories about, this is my childhood, and, the reason why I'm going to suggest that we're more open and free with sex is, I don't want you to go through what I went through, all this trauma and all this pain and, all this, whatever around sex. And so I'm just doing this to help you. And he starts to preach, all the free love stuff and intergenerational sex. So that's where some of the, the kind of the pedophilia stuff starts to come in as well, through those, and it's justified, through stories. And that's something that I am interested in. And if I can ever get my head around it, I would love to write something about how stories work and how you can use storytelling to kind of as part of one of many tools, to bring a cult through, because, these people they've joined this really strict group where you're not allowed to do any of this stuff. And then somehow really quickly he moves them from that position to actually being a prostitute.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Which is something that was particularly interesting in Mary Mahoney's book, Abnormal Normal, My Life and the Children of God, because she really does speak from her experiences, that transition that happens within the group. They're receiving Mo letters, and then all of a sudden one arrives that kind of describes what flirty fishing is, which they called FFing, which is more cult speak. So it really takes you through her kind of like, hang on, what? Okay, well, I've never had sex with anyone and I don't know how to do it, especially with a stranger. And then kind of her whole experience around that. So if anybody would ever kind of like to read what that looked like from the inside, I think Mary's book answers a lot of questions on sort of air quotes, how could you let that happen? Or why did you stay so long? I think her book is a great way of understanding that from the perspective of somebody that actually lived those experiences, because it's so easy for people on the outside to say, how could you stand by and not do anything? That's such a ridiculous question to ask for people that haven't studied anything to do with cult coercion and manipulation, and spiritual abuse in the way that you've just spoken about, using scripture to justify things, to explain why some things are happening. And that paired with Berg's own visions is a deadly mixture, because then he can say, I understand the biblical and religious text in this way, and this is how I interpret it. And I am the headship of this movement, and I'm having these visions, and you have to listen to these visions, and these visions are true because of my connection to things that are godly and my interpretation of the text, which is correct, and therefore my visions are correct. So all of these things that I am seeing is what we should be doing. And so when suggestions of child abuse are made, they are then carried out within the group. And David Ito, I think, actually spoke out about the group at one point. Is that right?
He did, yeah. Of course, the thing that people remember him for now is the murder-suicide, which I'm sure you know. He went through quite a lot. Obviously that's his story to tell. Well, it would be his story to tell and not mine. But he went through, a lot in terms of sexual abuse, and, he murdered somebody who had looked after him and abused him as a child, and then he committed suicide afterwards. So, it's one of our most tragic stories. It's the story of David Ito.
And it's really strange that the label Jesus baby is applied in those circumstances as well, because in other religious movements like the Unification Church, for children that are born outside of the matchings that are made by Reverend Moon or Mrs. Moon, there are different names given to those children that is lesser than true children born through the matching ceremony. So even that labeling is just really strange in itself.
But those children have been born, from the cult's perspective, they've been born out of their mothers doing the ultimate sacrifice. They've done an amazing, wonderful, brilliant thing for Jesus, like the ultimate thing you can do for Jesus. And a child born from that's not a negative thing. You're a Jesus baby.
And it was worded something like, Berg said something like, there's only one type of Bible a man will read. Speaking about a woman's body and sexual intercourse being the only way to speak to some men and bring them in to the movement. And of course, a lot of these arrangements came with financial payments and gifts, and everything that was in the Children of God was communal. So if you were to be given jewelry or money, all of that went back into the Children of God. So even if you were not successful in converting or recruiting new people into the Children of God, there is a possibility that your arrangements through Flirty Fishing would assist in the financial side of the movement and the trafficking of individuals around the world. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think a huge part of it was the money making, probably even more than winning people over, really, although winning people to Jesus was what was said was the goal. So that's so I guess we've kind of come through, a lot of the 70s and towards the end of the 70s, the 70s, like my parents would describe as, they were hard years in the Children of God. And the structure was what they called the chain, and it was became really hardcore about making money. And, you had targets and you were sent out to make those financial targets on the street. And sometimes they said to you, you weren't allowed to come home until you brought back your financial target. So things were really tough. And David Berg at this time, he also became unhappy with the structure and with what was going on. So he dissolves the internal structures in a move called the R&R. And this is around the time as well that they changed their name and they don't want to be called the Children of God anymore. And they say, we're the family of love now. So it's all so all the structures are dissolved and people suddenly have freedom that they didn't have before. So where previously you couldn't make your own, there's a lot of, you couldn't make your own choices and decisions. And then suddenly people had a bit more freedom. So, you could choose that you wanted to team up with another member of the group and go and pioneer somewhere. And, you had a bit more freedom. And I know my parents became, happier during this period. And it's sort of in those early years as well that of the R&R, I think that, messaging starts to come, about moving, to Asia and kind of, spreading, through all the world. But that's, one of their big rebrands that they do. And then, of course, when we hit the mid-80s, there's the AIDS scare. And that's when FFing has to end because there's a real fear that we're going to bring AIDS into the group. And, some other diseases like herpes were pretty rampant, I think, but, they didn't do much about that, but they were afraid of AIDS. Mm-hmm. And then I guess, so then they made a move that you were not allowed to have sex with anybody who was outside. The only exception to the rule was if there was somebody who'd been FFing for quite a while, and they were a really good, wealthy supporter, you could keep on keeping that relationship going. So I was aware as late as 1992 of what we would call a fish, who's somebody who's being FF'd. So I was aware of somebody as late as 1992 that I met who was a fish for the family. And then, of course, the other thing that had kind of shifted around this time is that a lot of people who joined in the 70s, by now they'd met, somebody and they got, married or they'd hooked up or whatever, and they started to have children. So you get kind of, I almost think about it as like waves of children, So like in the 70s, there was a few people who were couples and had some kids, but there wasn't like loads and loads and loads. But then the time I'm born, is kind of like the second wave of children that starts to come. And then they start to really increase their followers through the fact that they have loads of children and that contraception is banned completely. So everybody has like 8, 9, 10 kids, however many your body will allow you to have. And then, of course, you got to think about how we're going to structure our communes now because, there's a lot of kids and who's going to take care of the kids. And so, things kind of start to get structured around that. And as your kids get older, what do we do about that? And how are we going to make sure that they stay in the family and our missionaries and, all of these questions and, strategies around that start to come into play. And real fear around persecution. And I'll try and talk a bit about that a bit later on. That really ramps up in the 80s as well. And of course, we were prepping for the big 1993 return of Jesus, which didn't happen. And then, of course, when we realized that's not going to happen, we're still prepping for the end time, but he releases the What If series, saying, what if it happened next year? We don't know. Maybe the Antichrist is, kind of on the scene already, and we just don't know who he is. Like, could it be Yeltsin? Could it be this guy? Could it be that guy? Like, we don't know, all that kind of stuff.
But 93 is the year that you moved over to Ireland. So there must have been so much going on at that time in terms of trying to flee the country because of the condemnation that we are receiving from people that don't understand us, or people that are threatened by us, or people that fear us because we know the truth or something or other. So you've got all of that with the court case that's ongoing, but then you've also got this doomsday prophecy hanging over you all at that time as well.
Yeah. So it's, so I was going to talk a little about this later, but let's talk about it now because it's just the 80s is a weird time, so we are really, really frightened of persecution. And, we are starting to get bad press. There comes a point when there are raids on communes that happen in different parts of the world. And so there's this real fear around that. So real high security stuff going on, to the point where one of the things that comes out is that you've got to have a flea bag. And so a flea bag is like, if you think about the range of suitcases, it's like the smallest suitcase of the suitcase range. And, there was prescriptive contents that needed to be in your flea bag. So you got kind of like a change of clothes, maybe some water purification tablets, like a few, I can't remember everything, maybe a torch. I can't remember everything that was going in there, but it's just like, a handful of things. And you literally kept that under your bed. And you were supposed to, just be prepared to grab your flea bag and run at any time. So you'd leave all the rest of your stuff and go, because, if something is going to happen, you need to be ready to go. And then on the other side, we're stockpiling food, because in the end time, society could collapse, or, we don't know what's going to happen, and we might need to have food. So we hardly had any money. So it's difficult to stockpile food. But we did have some cans, and then we would have like these big vats, or like these massive tubs of water, like in the garden, that we were using to prepare for the tribulation. So it was like, it's weird, because these two different things kind of going on at the same time. And there's quite a funny story that in one of the communes I was living in the 90s, and we started to develop a code about what we would do if there would be a knock on the door and we needed to flee. And so the code was to do with white sugar, because white sugar was absolutely banned. Berg said it's worse than smoking, absolutely banned, nothing to do with white sugar. Or really sugar at all. He hated sugar. And so there was a code that if somebody knocks on the door, then the person that answers it would shout, can I have a cup of tea with one sugar? And then you would know, like, 1 sugar means everybody be quiet. 2 sugars means everybody has to go upstairs and hide in the bedrooms. 3 sugars means grab your flea bag and get out the door. And one time there was a knock on the door, and it was, it was just like a neighbor, or like it was nobody. And but it was a 3 sugar alert, and half of, these are massive communes, there are like 60, 70 people in there. And so you got like 70 people outside in the middle of a rapeseed field fleeing, with their flea bags, only to be called back 10 minutes later. No, it's okay. We're fine. It's mad. Like, it was mad.
I can't even imagine. It's kind of given me the imagery of when you hear the sirens going off in films around war, like the noise where they wind up, like, and everybody runs off to the bomb shelters.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this is like 30 years ago.
Yeah. This was our normal. But everything was high security. So if we needed to leave the building, we always had vans, because, there's a lot of people, to be shipping around. So, there's always vans. So you'd be in the back of the van, and everybody would have to duck down and stay beneath the windows until you got to a certain distance away from the commune, and then everybody could sit up. And at the time, we used to laugh about it, because, after you get to a certain distance, then whoever's driving would say, okay, you can get up now. And whoever's behind you suddenly sees, 20 kids or whatever popping their heads up in the back. And at the time, we used to laugh about it and think it was hilarious, because we were kind of had a little bit of self-awareness, so we must have looked mad as kids.
Oh my goodness. And this is just all in England as well, which is so strange for me to imagine, because usually people are talking about their experiences in parts of America that I've never been to. So I kind of just picture it from parts of America that I have been to. I kind of know what the roads look like. They're a lot bigger than ours. Everyone drives on the other side of the road. The vehicles that they drive look very different. So for you to talk about it from your perspective and know that the roads that you're driving down could be the roads that I lived on is so mad. That's so wild for me to really think about.
Yeah.
And so how did things change from 93 onwards? There's everybody has a flea bag. It's also strange for me to hear you talk about your experiences and know that Mary had the same instructions given to her. And so you can see there that no matter where Children of God members were around the world, the instructions were trickling down from the headship, and they were all exactly the same, and they were followed like to the letter.
Yeah. So it's a bit like, I kind of think of it like, to make it parallel, it's a bit like when you go to like an international chain, like McDonald's or something like that. You know, it doesn't matter where in the world you go, you're going to get a burger. What's different is that maybe the currency of the, you know, when you see the prices, it might be in a different currency. So there's like little differences, and your experience changes a little bit depending on which generation you are, or how close you are to the top, or what decade you were involved in. But overall, you know, the group is the group, and it came from the top, and that's how it was.
And after 93, where the end of the world doesn't happen and things kind of carry on, the world just carries on as normal. What's going on in your world at this point? How does the Children of God change overall?
Yeah, so there is a story that I kind of want to tell you. So I want to talk to you about teen camps and teen trainings, because that's a big deal. By the time we got to the mid-80s, we had this group of kids who were born in the 70s, especially the ones in the early 70s. These kids are becoming teenagers now. And so, the cult were thinking, like, what are we going to do about this? When people become teenagers, you start to want to discover your own identity. You go through this period of like, who am I? What do I want to be? What do I want to do? Can I do something funky with my hair? All that kind of normal teenager stuff. And, there was a real concern that, that kids weren't going to follow in the footsteps of their parents. And I think, the big crime of of that generation, the 70s babies, was that they were not enthusiastic enough about being in the cult. I think that was their big, the big thing that they kind of had against them. And so they started to, think about strategies of how they were going to deal with this. And so what they came up with was like teen training camps. And so these started, it must have been like 86, 87. And, they were definitely like in Asia, places like, Japan and the Philippines and Macau and South America, and they published a book called The Basic Training Handbook, where they detailed, how these camps were run, the schedule of the teens and, different things that they did inside. And this was felt, I think, by the leadership to be, a successful way forward. So this kind of ramps up for me by the time I get to be, 11, so around 91, because before that, I'm too young really to be impacted. So I'm one of the last to, probably be, involved in some of this kind of teen training. So in 1991, and the reason I want to talk about this is because, I mentioned that there's this court case, the British court case, and in it, Lord Justice Ward, he goes into a lot of detail talking about what happens in those camps, and it's not easy reading. And he talks about where those happened in the UK, and he lists a number of locations where he absolutely knows that it happened. And then at the end he says, I've heard rumours that this happened in Newcastle and in Scotland, but I don't know. And so there's nothing out there in the public domain to say 100% did happen. But I was one of the ones living in Newcastle, and it happened there. So part of the reason I want to tell the story is just because it's, it's one of the stories that isn't out there. But it, I think it just mirrors other people's experiences. So it's not like the story in general isn't out there, if that makes sense. So around this time of 91, there's a couple of things that are published. One of them is called the Tetchy series, and the other is called the Discipleship Training Revolution. And Tetchy is Karen Zerby, the current leader's second child. So she's her daughter. And apparently she was crying a lot and feeling really low, and the people looking after her, because, Karen didn't look after her own daughter, she had people to do that for her. they were kind of saying, this is too much, we can't manage. And so she decided to really get involved in her daughter's care. And there's a lot of forced confessions and, one-to-one prayer. And, I think she spends a lot of time in one room, with an adult, reading the word. That's what we would have called the cult publications. And this is sent out as kind of whenever things happen to Zerby's kids, that's like a manual for how all kids should be dealt with and handled, So, and then in the discipleship training revolution, she talks about these teen camps, and she's saying, well, what we really need is to roll these out in every home, because before what they were doing was they had one little commune set up, and what they would do is they would take kids away from their parents and they would send them to a different commune. So I believe what would happen is that you'd have to sign over, legal documents to basically give someone else your child. They became the legal guardian. And then, the kid could live in this other commune and go through these training things. So they'd be separated. But she kind of said, there's so many of these kids now, they all need this stuff. So we need to, really roll it out. And so this is the stuff that was kind of going on. And so I moved to Newcastle in 1991. And it was a weird time because a couple of days before I got there, something had gone missing in the home. Home is what we called a commune. So something had gone missing. And when something like that happened, they would have a witch hunt. And so there was a witch hunt going on. So that basically, they loved to do an exercise program. If you think about boot camp style exercises, they love to use that as a punishment. So I remember there being a morning when they made everybody kind of stand in a room with their arms outstretched. So if you think about the warrior pose in yoga, if you've ever done yoga, if you do the warrior pose for a bit, that can be, that gets real painful on your arms. And, so there was that kind of thing. And it was, because they wanted, somebody to crack and confess you'd taken this thing. And so then nobody confessed. And so after that, they brought everybody in one by one and asked them if they did it. And nobody had done it. And so then in the afternoon, they took everybody out and everybody had to run around fields and do duck walks. Do you know what a duck walk is? You do? Okay. That's not cult speak. Okay, good. And so that was the thing everybody really hated because that's quite, that gets quite painful too. And this just sort of went on for some time. And so this is a weird period for me. And then, so the guy who was kind of running this went on for, I don't know how long this went on for, maybe a few weeks. And then the guy who was running it left, and then things kind of eased up. And then I remember that we had the national area shepherds. So these are people who are in charge of the country. So you had people that were in charge of a commune, and then above them you had people in charge of a country, and then people in charge of the continent, and then above them you'd have Berg and the highest levels of structure. So we had the guys in charge of the country come to our home, and they brought all of the teens and young people. So everybody my age into a room, and they wanted us to write so there was a forced confession session. And so what they told us was that we needed to sit down and write down everything we'd done that was bad. And we also needed to report on everybody else, anything that they knew. And if we held anything back and it came out through somebody else's confession, then we were really going to get in trouble. So we all had to sit there for a couple of hours and just write everything we could possibly think of. And then they left and not much was said. And then shortly after that, 2 of the boys were invited to go to a teen home, and they didn't want to go. And at the time I didn't understand why, because I was young and I wasn't really clued in, but it was presented as, this is one of those, offers that you can't refuse, They said they had to go. And so they would be, the 2 oldest boys were sent to one of these teen training homes. And while they were gone, they started to kind of play around with silence restrictions. So silence restriction is when you're not allowed to speak. And sometimes you have to wear a sign around your neck saying, "Do not talk to me, I'm on silence restriction." So they started to kind of play around with this. So you'd be on for a couple of weeks and then they would take you off and then they would put you back on. And so this went on for a while. But it was the reason I call this a strange time is because there was one adult man in the home, the father of one of the boys that got sent to the teen camp, who I think really did want to give us kids a good life. So he would try and organize trips to the beach, when he could, like on a Sunday, and try and do nice things here and there. But it was like, this one kind of nice guy trying to do those things, and then in between that, we had this kind of other weird stuff going on, which I don't quite know how to describe, but excessive punishments. And then after they were away for a couple of months, they came back and they were really, really quiet and wouldn't say where they'd been or what they'd done or wouldn't tell us anything. And then a short while after that, this woman turns up at our commune. And I remember asking my mum, like, who is she? Because it was really weird because she wasn't married, she didn't have any children, and she came on her own. There's like 3 things that never happened to women in the group, right? So I remember asking my mum, like, who is she? Being really curious. And my mum said she didn't know. And so this woman kind of hangs around for a few days, and then she calls us all into the living room, and she tells us that we're all going to be put on the Victor program, and she explains what the rules are going to be. So that includes no communicating. So this goes further than silence restriction in the UK. This is no communicating. So that means no using your hands to make sign language, no eye contact. So if an adult looked at me, so if the person who was running the program looked at me and asked me to answer a question, I would have to look them in the eye. But if I walked into a room and and you were there and I looked at you and I got caught looking at you, that would count as communication. And then that would be a demerit. So one of the parts of it was that there was a demerit chart, and if you got 5 demerits, then you got beaten with a switch. So that was part of it. And her favourite saying was "chalk up a double." That was her catchphrase. Chalk up a double, so you get 2 demerits. And then she said, we're taking away all your privileges. So for us, a privilege would mean things like every day you were supposed to have 1 hour outside, because Berg had written this letter called Get Out, and he said you had to spend 1 hour every day outside. And that was a time generally when we could be kids. Like, we didn't have a childhood because your childhood spent, like cooking and cleaning and looking after the younger kids and whatever. But that was like an hour when, generally speaking, quite often, unless you were looking after the younger children during that hour. But you could be, for me at that time, I could be a kid. You could run around and you could, maybe play a game or something like that. So privileges like that were taken away, and you had to fill out a chart every day that was another chart that was on the wall every day. And it was, this complete invasion of your privacy, because you had to tick every time you had a poo, you had to say how many cups of water you drunk, like everything was on there. And it was like in the hallway for the entire commune to see all of this information about you. And then they said we had to write what they called an OHR, an open heart report. And so every day, in the middle of the day, you'd have to fill this out, and it would have, more personal information on there. And then they would say you had to write your reaction to the word. So what cult literature have you read today? What's your reaction to it? So you have to say, well, I've learned that, it's really important to pray constantly, or, so we don't let the devil in, like that kind of stuff. And then you'd have to write down what your kind of like your need work-ons were. So that was like, I'm learning. You have to be real careful what you said, though, right? Because if you say like I'm learning not to have doubts, it's like, oh, that's a red flag, So you had to be really careful what you said, but you had to say something, because otherwise you're not being honest. So it was like one of those real tricky, horrible situations. And actually, I wanted to read you something that Lord Justice Ward said, because it kind of says it better than I ever could, but the frustration of what that was like as a kid. He said, OHRs were widely used as a means of forcing confession, with the result that the children were made to feel guilty if they did not confess. If they had no NWOs, they were said to be self-righteous and proud. If they expressed their doubts and their antipathies, then they were murmuring. Either way, they could not win. So it was like, whatever you did was wrong. And so I remember when we were sitting there, one of the kids, there was a little opportunity to ask questions, like, you need to understand the rules, and this is your one time when you can speak before this is all in place. And so one of the kids says, well, how long are we on for? And she says, well, when you don't want to come off, that's when you're ready. So I just thought, oh my God, I'm going to be on forever. Because there was no reason, like I hadn't committed a crime or hadn't done anything wrong specifically. It was literally just because they were rolling this out, across all of the homes. And then what they wanted to do really was they wanted to take us back to the early days of the revolution. They're trying to, instill in us the kind of the excitement and the fervor of our parents' generation. And in some ways, they were using some of the same techniques that they used with our parents, because, they isolated our parents from their parents, so from our grandparents. And now I was isolated from my parents. So, 11 years old and not allowed to, to speak to your mum or your brothers and sisters. And, I think for me, the worst part of it was that isolation and loneliness, just because love and belonging and family and connection, they are fundamental human needs. And when you're upset, you want your mum and, you want to go and give them a hug. And then when you have that hug, it helps you to kind of self-regulate your emotions, and it kind of, calms you down. And, we couldn't have that. And then the other part was just the hopelessness, because, you're being punished, but you don't know why, and you don't know how long for. And I kind of almost felt like, if they could have just given us a date and said it's going to be this long, then it's a bit like, maybe like when you're on a diet or something and you can just say, well, I'm doing it for a month and cross down the days, but they wouldn't give us that. And in the end, this part was for 6 months that I was on for. And so what happened was that, in the first few days, I felt this kind of like panic. And I was going to the bathroom and making myself, trying desperately to make myself throw up, unsuccessfully, because, I just wasn't very good at it. And I think that came from being an asthmatic, and, they don't let you have medicine in a group like that. So I just used to have to wait out my asthma attacks. But then they would let me stay in bed. So I kind of felt like if I could just show them that I'm sick, and they wouldn't let you just go to bed if you were sick, if there was no physical evidence. You couldn't just say, I don't feel well. You had to have like a fever, or you had to be vomiting, or you had to. So I kind of felt like if they could see that I was vomiting, maybe they would just let me go to bed, and I could, just spend some days in bed. But, it didn't take me very long to realize that wasn't going to work out. And so, my mental health went downhill just really, really rapidly, like scarily rapidly. And within a couple of weeks, I had what I can only describe now as psychotic depression. And because I had an episode where it was at night, and I saw a person who wasn't there, and it really frightened me. And I was also having, suicidal thoughts for the first time in my life. And, this terrified me. So when I had my OHR, I wrote it down, that this had happened to me. And, they came back and they said, well, okay, so, you clearly are experiencing demon, an attack from the devil and, demon possession. So as a result of that, I had to have an exorcism. So I had 2 exorcisms during the first probably month that I was on this program as well. And that, that involved people, you had to kneel down on the floor, and everybody would crowd around you, and they would all just chant and speak at once. So they'd be speaking in tongues and praying, and, they would be casting the devil out of you. And It's right. It's quite frightening to go through that experience and to be told that there's a demon, and it's humiliating because it's all your peers and your friends, and yeah. And then I think probably the worst part about it was that the reason that I was going through this was because I was having mental illness, and that was their solution. And at the end, it's like, okay, so we've solved that problem, so you can go back onto the program that made you sick in the first place. So that's kind of that's what happened, and we were on that for 6 months, and then at the end of the 6 months, this woman who set it up, she set it up for a month, and then during that month she was training 2 adults in the home to run the program. So then she left it in their care, and then she moved on to set it up somewhere else. So she just did the rounds of the UK. So I would say, I don't want to put hand on heart and say 100%, but, pretty much everybody who's around my age who was in the UK was on one of these programs. And so after 6 months, she came back, and, we were allowed to come off. But then a couple of weeks later, we had a lady come down from Scotland, and she put us all back on again. But she introduced something new we hadn't had before, which I think had been going on in Scotland quite a bit, which was called intensive care. And that was that she set up a caravan in the garden, and for the very worst cases, people would be put in the caravan, so it's solitary confinement, and you were either alone or you had an adult in there, reading and praying with you. And that could be like a week or 10 days. So this went on for a few more weeks, and then they had to end it. And the reason that they ended it, I'm sure, is because of this court case in London where they thought they were going to lose. And Lord Justice Ward, he had all this information about what was going on in these programs. And, he was writing about it, and they kind of realized, and he was making them make promises, you guys better promise that you're going to change some stuff, or, this kid's not going to be able to stay with us. But, one of the things that Berg used to say is God can only use broken men and women. And so it wasn't, they had this thing that they intentionally tried to break people. They wanted to break people psychologically. It was part of the strategy.
The time when you are experiencing these exorcisms and this dip in your mental health, you said this was in the first few weeks of the program starting. So is this when you are 11 years old?
Yeah, I'm 11. Yeah.
Because 11-year-olds are still such tiny people.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, when my son, he's a little bit older than 11 now, but when he was 11, I used to look at him and just think, my God, now I feel so much compassion for myself as a child, because can you imagine?
And your parents probably don't, well, they might have an idea of what goes on in the program, but they can't see you and what's actually happening to you in real time.
Exactly. And, and there's no way to know how much they were told. If I speak to my dad about it, he's like, I didn't know. I just didn't know. And, my first is, why didn't you know? You should know, you're my dad. But he's like, yeah, I didn't know. We weren't allowed to know.
There's a part in Mary's book where she talks about how all of the parents they parented all of the children together.
Yeah.
So if there was some discipline that some of the adults felt needed to be carried out on some of the children, whether that was in the form of a switch or a paddle or some other horrible punishment, in terms of physical punishment, any parent or any other adult in the group could administer that punishment to your child. So at times, Mary would have to stand there and watch her children be struck by other adults who felt like her children needed disciplining for speaking back or questioning or being too loud or playing too long. And she could never speak out and say that punishment is too harsh, because then she would be seen to be favouring her own children, which would get them punished further and her punished as well.
Yeah.
And that is so hard to think about, having to make that decision in your own mind. The environments in these high demand religious groups reach these almost crescendos of abuse. Everybody is in that fight flight mode. Everybody's trying to survive, and everybody's trying to save themselves one way or another, even if that means writing about other people and the things that you've seen them do, which might get them into trouble, but stops you from getting into trouble if it's found out that you knew this information and you didn't come forward with it. It's so much, isn't it? It's just really hard to think about. This was when you were 11. Other children have gone through these experiences, and it had all the severity of that particular training had ended by the time you were 12.
Yeah, so I was still on. I had my 12th birthday during the program. So it was towards the end of that 6 months. I turned 12. And then obviously when we were put back on again, I was 12 during that time. So I would say it was the autumn of 92 when we were taken off, which is really late. And I think that's that would have been the sort of the end, really, that period when they realized they couldn't run those types of training anymore.
And the training was implemented by Zerby herself.
The instructions came from her, and they were handed down to a couple of people. And definitely some of the ideas that were used in the UK, they came from the Philippines. So I think that the woman who ran it, I think she'd sort of seemed to pop up out of nowhere, because, in the UK, you sort of knew a lot of the people, because of all the moving around, and she just seemed to appear out of nowhere. But I believe she'd been in the Philippines, and the Philippines was, I believe, one of the worst of the training camps. From the stories I hear, I think it exceeds anything I went through. But she'd brought her techniques from over there.
And I wonder if that has something to do with laws around child protection in general, and if it was more severe in the Philippines because of the differences in law, even though the practices that were or would have been carried out in the Philippines at that time were still carried out in secret, and PO boxes existed, and nobody had personal mobile phones or anything like that. And I did actually want to ask you a little bit about the differences in some things in terms of, in comparison to other people's stories, around things like education, because I know that in America, the homeschooling laws are very relaxed or very lacking, or whichever way people would like to look at it. I think there's a very small set of conditions or standards that have to be met for homeschooling to be approved in America. And so a lot of the children that were being homeschooled in the Children of God probably didn't have to be learning any type of accredited curriculum. But I don't know if that's different in England. But I also don't know if there was no access to birth control, if there was no, I don't know what it looked like in terms of access to midwives and hospitals with the amount of pregnancies and births that were happening, if women needed to be seen before, during, or after a pregnancy and a labour, what that looked like. And then also if every baby that was born in the Children of God in England would even be registered under the NHS, and so given an NHS number and then registered as an actual human being on a system, on a file with a name and a date of birth and their parents' signatures and stuff. So I wondered if you kind of have any insight around that, because if so many people are being born and they're never registered, it's almost like they don't exist. So how could there be any intervention from things like Child Protective Services and social services if nobody knows that those children exist in the first place?
Yeah. So you would register the birth, so you would have a birth certificate, and possibly a passport because of the international travel, and then those are the only documents that you would have. So you were not allowed to go to the doctor, so you're going to have no medical records. You can't have any vaccines, so there's going to be no vaccination records. In terms of school, you were not allowed to have any kind of qualifications. They were only interested in giving you a maximum of primary school level education, and I say maximum because most of us didn't even have, that. It was so patchy. So there'd be a lot of subjects you didn't learn anything about. So you could all read and write to some extent. We could all read. When I say write to some extent, I know I really struggled with spelling because, education, right? And we could all do basic maths, but it wasn't really considered that you needed to go beyond fractions. And then, of course, being a Christian organization, we didn't believe in things like evolution, and you wouldn't learn much about science. And then what you learned about history tended to come from, the group's teachings about history. So you'd learn things like that the Holocaust is just didn't exist, or if it did, it was not in the way that, the Jews want you to believe. So like when you leave the group, some of the things that you did learn in terms of your education, you have to go and relearn because they're not giving you accurate information. I can't remember. There was a lot of questions. I can't remember what the others were.
Yeah, no, sorry. I do tend to do that.
But I didn't know all the answers. Oh, with could you go to the hospital? So home births were encouraged. You could, you probably could have like a visit. You couldn't have like regular appointments or checkups with a doctor or nurse, but you might have, an appointment during your pregnancy. If you had like complications or something, then you could have hospital birth. So I was born in a hospital,
Okay.
and then the next two sisters I had were born at home. And then the fourth one, there was really major complications and my mum nearly died. And so she had to be rushed into, with an ambulance into the hospital. And they said to her, you need to have hospital births after this. So then I believe the rest were all born in hospital. But I think like the gold standard, if you really wanted to be a good cult lady, then would be to have at home, and also no painkillers. So gas and air was kind of like, okay, all right, so you need a little help. But anything beyond that was really like, you can tell it's run by a man,
Who is an alcoholic or alcohol dependent.
Yeah. I mean, that's just cruel.
And when you mentioned there a bit before that there were no vaccinations or anything, just a quick aside to go back on something that we spoke about earlier. So when you visited India and you and your family got very sick, I'm guessing there was no vaccinations or any medical preparation in terms of visiting that part of the world?
No, absolutely none.
Because if we were to travel to that country today or visit that part of the world, there's like a whole host of things that you have to go through, because there are so many diseases and viruses and so many differences in the terms of it, like the water that's consumed or how our bodies can't handle the tap water in those parts of the world, because it's so different to what we have in England, that you have to almost go through sort of like a do's and don'ts in India. I think my friend went over there and she ended up really, really sick because she was buying bottled water from a local shop near to the hostel that she was staying in. And she only found out after a few days of being there from other people in the hostel that had been there longer, that the shop owners were just filling the bottles up with the tap water, and selling them as closed bottles of water.
Right.
So every time she then went to buy a new bottle of water, she had to check that the actual seal hadn't been broken, so that she knew that she was getting clean bottled water, because she was so sick. She couldn't stop vomiting. She had terrible diarrhea. She was sweating horribly. So for you to actually move over to India and for your family to get that sick, first of all, it's not a surprise because it's such a different and experience and shock to the body. But also, do you think your parents had reservations about you moving over there because of these things? Was there sort of a conversation that anybody had with you on how to prepare for a different climate, for a different culture, and any of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, they were, I think, really excited to go. There was a lot of training, especially when I was, really little. A lot of training me to wash my hands. So if I touched the ground, I had to wash my hands. So the family, they developed a lot of really strict hygiene rules that you had to abide by, and that came from having so many people in Asia. And so you did have to sterilize the water, and you had to, for the washing up, you had to have you had to have 4 bowls that you put each dish through. One of them had bleach and different things. So they were trying to keep the hygiene going inside of the commune. But of course, you do need vaccines. You do need to prepare for these things. So there were a lot of people who did get sick, and I know that there were people who had malaria, and and other tropical diseases. But the thinking at the time was that if you trust in Jesus, Jesus protects you, right?
And kind of pulling us back from that little aside that I just dragged us over to. So when children are born in England into the Children of God at this time, the births are registered, which means that there has to be an address that's put onto the birth certificate. So I wonder what addresses were being placed onto those certificates at that time, because if there is a birth that doctors are questioning, that midwives are questioning, and they want to kind of keep an eye on that situation. If a woman comes in and she's malnourished, or she's presenting with ill mental health, or marks on her bodies, or marks on her body, then there might be somebody that kind of writes in that person's notes that maybe the first notes that person even has written in their notes, that they have concerns. I think when a person has a baby in England, the midwives kind of come round to the house 2 or 3 times before they sign you off to say that they're happy with everything, that they're happy that the baby's feeding, the baby's a good weight. They don't see any visible problems, so they're happy for the family to be discharged from the care of the midwives in the NHS. But that's so strange to think about that procedure not existing in the Children of God. Of course, it might have been different in sort of the 80s and 90s anyway, with the way that the NHS that ran things, and whether they did such frequent home visits or any home visits at all. And then, of course, if there's no way to track any concerns, then there's no way for that information to be passed over to social services, who then might be able to start doing house calls and checks.
Yeah, exactly. And I know definitely at that time, if you were homeschooled, you were supposed to be visited by, it was legal to homeschool your child, but you were supposed to be visited by a sort of an education officer. But because we moved around so much, that was one of the things that we were avoiding, by staying under the radar.
I suppose by moving so much as well, even if you were to come under the radar of a social worker or child protective services for one reason or another, then if you move to another part of the country, you'd be out of that borough or that jurisdiction. So that social worker would no longer handle that case because you've moved, and there's no forwarding address. It's not like you could just say, hey, Merseyside, there's somebody moving down to Suffolk, and we need you to keep an eye on them because we're worried. We've seen, some things, some signs and symptoms of things that we're concerned about, because they have no idea where you're being moved to, and it may not even be in the country.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I don't think there's anything that social services particularly could have done differently, to pick up what was going on.
When you were growing up in the UK, so I suppose up until the age of 13, do you remember the biggest commune size roughly that you lived in, and what that looked like in terms of like a farm or a homestead or just a big sort of farmhouse?
Yeah. In terms of numbers, I never really counted the people, but it could have been anywhere up to 100. But it tended to be houses that were rented, and they would be often sort of in the countryside. I suppose you can imagine, like, thinking logically about the practical difficulties of getting a house that's going to fit 100 people. If you go to the city centre, it's probably expensive and hard to find, the right size. So they tended to be a little bit further out in villages. But yeah, they were just big houses, like maybe 5-6 bedroom houses, and then everybody would just be crowded into a bedroom. So you'd have you could have a room and you could have like 10 people sleeping in a room, because we would use like bunk beds. So you'd have like triple bunk beds, and then underneath the bunk beds you'd have trundle beds, which are beds that slide out from there. So you could have 3 beds that kind of fold into each other, a bit like a Russian doll. And so you could use every inch of space for a bed, but then in the morning you could kind of tuck it away, so you could have a bedroom that had like a little bit of space in the middle. So I guess my memories are just like, yeah, a big house, but cramped conditions.
Do you remember the point in your life where you got your own bedroom to yourself, and like what you did with that space? Like maybe it was in your adulthood or once you'd left the movement. I just imagine that that's a poignant and significant moment in somebody's life if they've never had space for themselves, like ownership over posters that you stick on the wall, or entertainment systems, or videotapes or books, or whatever it might be that you're interested in.
Yeah, I guess like the first time I lived on my own was when I went to university. And I had, I was in dorms and I had my own little room, but I didn't put anything on the wall because like I didn't know what to put on there, And I remember then moving in, getting a flat with another girl, and she went away, to see her family for Easter and stuff, and I slept on the sofa with the TV on because I couldn't cope with being alone.
I imagine it's such a strange shift to go from being in such a busy environment your entire life to just being in a flat on your own with all the space and no other people around you. Even when I sit down at the end of the day, if my partner's on a night shift and the kids are asleep in bed, I kind of just sit on the sofa and it's really quiet, and I'm thinking it's a bit like overwhelming, even though there's nothing happening. It's strange. So for you to be surrounded by so many people for your whole life, and then to just kind of be not, it must be very strange, a very strange change and transition. But just to go back on a few points that we started to make earlier, before moving on to some other things. Zerby started to make decisions and to bring new things in the late 80s and early 90s, but this is before Berg's death. So did he kind of pull back on his responsibilities, or did he get ill, or what was the reasoning for her stepping up when he was still kind of labeled as leader of the church?
Yeah, you're right, because like in the early days she was just a scribe, and in the letters she would just be asking him a question, and quite often he would say, "Oh, you're so stupid, honey," to her, and that would be transcribed and sent out for everyone to read. But then like towards definitely in the 90s, she's kind of really stepping up, and she's writing her own letters, which are being sent out to us. One of them was the Back on Track series. So after they closed down the Victor programs and the teen training camps, when I'm in Ireland, things kind of loosen up again. We always go through these swings where it loosens up, then they try and tighten up, and then loosens up. So it kind of loosens up a little bit, and people have, a little bit more freedom. I mean, not like freedom in the sense that in the outside world, we can choose what we eat and what we listen to and what we wear and whatever. But for us, freedom. And then she releases this series called Back on Track, because she says, all the teenagers are, just doing their own thing, and we're not, we're getting off the track. Then she tightens up again, and that David Berg was still alive, but that came from her. And I haven't looked at this again since I left, so I hope this is correct. But I remember at the time there was a line in it that said, "I haven't told Grandpa about this yet." And I remember thinking, like, what? What do you mean you haven't told Grandpa about this? Like, doesn't Grandpa know everything? But evidently she was doing stuff at that point, and that is really shortly before he dies. So, I don't know all the details, but I suspect that as he gets sicker, she gets stronger, in terms of the control that she starts to have. But then in the background, I think, she was always there manipulating and, kind of, she was always there. So I think she probably was a little bit of the power behind the scenes. And she certainly manipulates herself into positions. So when he does die, we don't hear about it for 6 months, but she's organized everything so that there's a very smooth transition and nobody questions or challenges that she's, of course, the next leader.
Which was absolutely going to be my next question. So Berg dies in 94, but it's only 6 months on that you hear about this. And because of the steps that Zerby's taken pre-death and post-death, she's already established herself as leader of the Children of God, or the Family International, or the Family of Love, or whichever name the group is going by at this point. So nobody really questions who's going to take over now, who's going to be the leader. She's kind of already established that she has taken full control.
Yeah, that's right. And way back when, Berg had released a prophecy at one point about Peter and Heidi, and, from that story, but he'd kind of, and so she used that, and of course, this is the fulfillment of that prophecy. So there was, that going on as well. And so certainly, like, my family, like, we were kind of like the worker ants, of the colony. So we were at the bottom. And so I don't know, I can't speak to how it was at the top, but certainly at the bottom, nobody questioned or thought anything of it. It was, we were shocked that Berg had died, but then, she came in, and then of course she hit us at the same time with, within a very short period, with the charter. So that was another restructure. And part of that was, she brought out this really thick book, and she was like, this is the rules that you all have to live by, if you want to be a member of the family. And part of it was dissolving these big homes, these big communes. So you still had to live communally. One of the rules was that you had to have 4 voting adults. So you would vote on like a leadership team within your little commune. You still had to follow all the rules and whatever, without question, that the leadership said. But you had to have 4 people over 16. But you were supposed to break up the commune. So then it became a big panic, because everyone was just like, well, what are we going to do now? Who are we going to live with? Where are we going to go? And how am I going to get a house? And I think, the people who had a bit more of the, some people managed it a bit better than others. Like my family was okay because my dad's, in terms of practicalities, he was quite switched on. He'd, from time to time, he'd been like the finance guy of a commune. And so he was kind of like, he knew how to get a house and he knew how to do things. So we were okay. But there were other people who, single moms and stuff like that, who'd, maybe just been on childcare the whole time. And it was hard for them to kind of work out what they were going to do next. There was no help or support or, we're going to give you this chunk of money to get you going into, whatever. You just had to work out on your own. So that was a time of, that was an interesting time. So maybe people were thinking more about where they were going to live than will I follow Zerby? I don't know.
I think that's probably right. And maybe she did those two things at the same time in that way for that reason. I think I remember from Mary's conversation that she said that Zerby started to release her own series of Mo letters that were even more wild in the language and instructions than what Berg had been releasing. She started to say that every time you had sex, you were having sex with Jesus. So you were to imagine Jesus was the person that you were having sex with when you were going out flirty fishing or with your partner or something along those lines.
Yeah.
But Zerby being so complicit and aware of the sexual abuse that was happening not only to her own son, Davidito, who we mentioned earlier on in the episode, but from what had happened to herself as well through being used and pimped by her own husband. It's almost like there's like a folie à deux happening, like her and Berg are sharing this same madness and encouraging this intergenerational love to take place, which of course is just a pleasant way of wording paedophilia and child abuse and child sexual abuse, which is what the Children of God unfortunately is most infamous or notable for.
Yeah. And she does these things in really quick succession. So it's literally telling us Berg's died, here's a video of him, here's the charter. And they tended to release a lot of stuff around in February because that was Berg's birthday. So we used to have to fast for 3 days before his birthday. And then, you'd often get a new revelation. So we kept on with that. But she rebranded it the feast, and she would release her revelations at the feast. So you knew every year there was going to be a big thing coming, but you didn't know if it would mean you'd have to move house or you just have to adopt a new belief, So it's like, charter comes out, and then, so that's like 95, and then 96, she's releasing Loving Jesus, saying everybody's got to picture Jesus in their minds when they have sex. And then it's only like 1 to 2 years later, she's releasing more stuff promoting intergenerational relationships, but not child adult, but second generation people who were like, 18 years old should be getting together or sharing, that's what they called sex, with, first generation adults. So she was really promoting that kind of stuff. And, with the rationale of it's for unity, to bring everybody together. And then she starts publishing stuff about second generation who have left, saying that you shouldn't let your younger children have contact with your children who have left. So essentially completely shunning second generation former members. And so obviously when I left, that had recently been published. So I left in the knowledge that, I may never see my family again. So that was really hard.
And the letters around intergenerational relationships, was this something that Berg had promoted himself before he passed away, or is this something that became more prevalent as Zerby took over?
I suppose there weren't that many adult second generation while Berg was alive. So just a handful, really. So I don't remember, and I'd have to check this out and look it up, but I can't remember him specifically talking about marriage between the generations as something. Obviously, there's things about, free love and age doesn't matter and stuff like that. That kind of messaging was out there. But this is a slightly different twist on it that she brings in.
And Berg was practicing polygamy. He had a number of people that he had married A lot of the women he was involved with were under the age of consent, legal consent. And there are reports of him also encouraging children under the age of consent to take part in sexual activities with each other, sometimes while he watched, sometimes while he took part. These are all things that you can read online. I don't know why you would want to go and find these types of things to read. They usually just come hand in hand with researching different cults and groups. But all of this stuff that we're kind of talking about here is why the Children of God has been labelled as one of the worst cults in history, because of the decades of unreported sexual abuse that happened to children, physical abuse, spiritual, emotional, and then of course with the adults, all of the same abuses applied, but there was also financial abuse and human trafficking, where people would have their passports taken away from them. Mary spoke about being stuck in Japan. She didn't speak the language. She had to give all of her money back to the Children of God. She didn't have her passport because all valuables were kept in a safe away from her access. She had all of her children with her that she was responsible for. So, and the pressures to go out flirty fishing and witnessing on the streets to raise money and to not come home until she'd made enough. So there really was not many options for Mary, and I imagine so many others who had just been uprooted time and time and time again and sent to these different parts of the world where they had not had vaccinations, where they didn't know where their passports were, where they didn't have enough money to buy food for the family for that evening. So I don't focus too much on the sexual abuse of children that took place within the Children of God, because I feel like that is available to read about on the internet, maybe more so than a lot of the other things that happened inside the movement that I feel are very important to discuss. Of course, that's not me saying that the sexual abuse of children is not important to discuss, but there's so many other methodologies and things that took place in these types of groups that I feel are so important to highlight. And that includes things like the training camp that you've mentioned. And so on your journey so far, you know, after kind of summarizing the Children of God history with Berg and now Zerby and where we are now, and your journey kind of 0 to 13, you had a few experiences of moving out of the country. You'd been to Switzerland, and then your father was kicked out. Switzerland just do everything right, I think. Maybe not kind of personally against your father, but they have such a great economy. Their crime rates are really low. They're really neutral when it comes to like political affiliations and all of that stuff. And they recognize straight away that there is somebody or a group of people on their streets witnessing in a way that they don't agree with. And they're like, you can't stay here. I just feel like Switzerland just have so many things like down properly. But you've been to Holland. You go over to India and that doesn't work. You try India again later on, but that doesn't work. And so in 93, you find yourselves in Ireland. Loads of stuff happens around that time. And then in 96, you finally leave the UK and settle in Europe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we go to Hungary, and there's a big presence of Children of God in Hungary by this time. After the wall came down, people started to, go over to Eastern Europe and set up communes there. I think there was a little bit of that going on before, but, kind of quite discreetly and undercover. But then they could really come out in the open and set up the communes. And so we were kind of in so I've spoken about some of the, the teachings and the, and the letters that come out around that time. But we were in a bit of a weird, home where it was all, when we moved in, it was all nationals, so local, so Eastern Europeans, and then we'd moved in. But they had got the impression from the things they'd been reading, like the Back on Track series, that people from the West were just really off track. And so they'd had like formed quite a negative opinion of us and felt like, their duty would be to kind of reform. And so definitely one of the guys there, he'd found this basic training handbook, which was the handbook for these camps and training programs. It was like, we need to be doing this with the kids. And I know my dad, to his credit, said to him, we can't, we've already tried that and we can't do it again. But that was quite a difficult time because it was.
So you're sort of around about 16 at this time.
Yeah, so I'm 16. So I'm considered to be an adult. So I'm doing adult duties, in the commune, but then also just constantly getting, just constantly being given a hard time because I'm being perceived as this, Western teenager.
And the responsibilities that you had at this time, did anybody work jobs outside of the Children of God, or was it mostly the men that went outside and had sort of secular jobs, and the women stayed in to take care of the children, to do the education, to do the cooking and cleaning and maintenance of the communes?
So nobody in the Children of God or the family was allowed to have a job of any kind. That was completely against the rules. So to make money, you had to, obviously there came a point when FFing was banned and you couldn't do that anymore. But that's when they started to produce their own literature. So they produced posters, which would have like a massive picture on one side and then loads of cult messaging on the reverse, so you could sell those on the street. They produced cassette tapes of music for outsiders, so you could sell those on the streets, but that didn't tend to be particularly effective. So another technique that was used was going shop to shop. So you go from one shop to another and you try and speak to the business owner and sell them a cassette tape, or you would go door to door, a bit like Jehovah's Witnesses, try and sell them. And then they started to produce videos as well, so like kids videos, and so you could sell those too. So that was kind of like a big money generator. And then towards when I get to be about 16, 17, they start to try and develop some new things. So they start to do like ballooning. So, people paint their face as a clown and, create balloons and sell them on the street. So they start to explore like a few different things. But everybody got involved with that. It tended to be that when children were looked after, that was by the women mostly. And, so it was like, those traditional roles, gendered roles, but women also went out on the street and were fundraisers too.
And at what age are you expected to go out and to start trying to sell some of this propaganda?
Birth, I can't remember a time when I wasn't doing this. When you're
so you have
so when you're a baby, your mum straps you on their back. There's photos of me and my mum's back, or she's out there selling literature and carrying me around with her. So there's not a time when you're not doing that. And then when you can toddle around and walk, then you can be the one to hand the poster to the person and they give the money to you or your dad or whatever. So yeah, we're always out.
Oh my gosh, that's just so strange to think about, my little kind of 2-year-old toddling around, because I would just give him so much money if I saw him on the street, I think, and he was trying to hand me something.
Oh yeah, especially the younger ones tend to perform better. And then you went through a bit of a difficult period, when you were sent out fundraising, when you were sort of 13, 14, 15, because you're not so cute anymore, yeah.
But you start to feel that responsibility that the adults must feel around kind of coming back with something to show for your witnessing efforts in terms of money.
Absolutely. And it was quite, they kind of made it quite competitive. So, everybody wants to sell the most and, make the most money. And then they made it competitive between the communes as well. So you have like league boards, where they would say the shiners, these are the shiners, the top posterers, the top tape sellers of the country or the whatever.
And you would be expected to go and carry out these things whichever country you were in?
Yeah, definitely.
Do you remember any particular experiences on it being difficult in any other country trying to communicate with people, maybe a language barrier, or even just a currency, different currencies?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It was difficult. But they would teach you like some basic words for like postering. You would learn some basics, but yeah, it was hard, and people would say things to you and you didn't know what they meant. But normally you would have somebody who was native to the country would be around as well. So either you go, because one of the rules is you have to be 2 by 2. You were never allowed to be alone. So if you had to be out doing these things, you're always in a pair. So quite often it would be somebody who was a native speaker would be out there with you.
And when you mentioned earlier about how brothers and sisters would look after brothers and sisters, what age did parentification start in terms of you kind of taking on that parental role for a younger brother or sister?
The earliest I remember doing this was 6. So it was when we were trying to raise money to go to India for the second time, and my parents had to find the money for this. So they were allowed to go out, or they were told to go out together as a team to go fundraising. And then they said that they thought that there were people looking after us, but there weren't people looking after us. So I was like looking after my youngest sister.
Wow.
Who was
how many brothers and sisters were there all together?
At that point, 4.
And how many are there now?
There's 9 of us now.
Wow. Okay. Oh, so after the 4th, your mum was told she would have to keep going back to hospital for a baby. Yeah. So she had 5 more in hospital.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And you said that you were the first one to leave.
Yeah.
So, if you moved over to Hungary in 96 and things were difficult because you were coming from a certain part of the world where everybody had kind of the wrong idea about the type of people you were, and it was strained and you found it difficult, is this kind of where you started to become discontented with the movement, where you started to think something's not quite adding up here for me?
Yeah, that's right. And it was before we went over that I first started to think that I might want to leave. I had this dream about being a nurse, but then when we went over there, like once you go over there, there's no way to get back. Like, that's a long way. I'm not going to get a ticket and somewhere to stay. So I kind of gave all that up and just thought, well, I'm here now. But then I couldn't ignore, it's a funny thing because, when abuse happens, it's harder, it's easier to see it happening and recognizing that it's abuse when it's happening to other people than it is to yourself, And so I was seeing stuff going on, and a lot of the messaging and things everybody talked about was love, and God is love, and we love one another, and love's the most important thing. But what was going on was not loving, And then I was looking at all the hypocrisy, and there was some dreadful things. Like there was this guy who, we got a call one day, and it was a guy who was an Eastern European national, and he was trying to cross a border, and they wouldn't let him through because he didn't have enough money. And he called up our commune and said, I need somewhere to stay. Like, I'm stuck at this train station and, and I don't know what to do. Can you help me? We were like an hour away and we wouldn't help him. And I remember because I was 16, I was like, well, I have some kind of a voice. So I was like saying, well, can't we do something? Like, we can't leave him on his own. But nobody would do anything. And I met him, a few months later, and he told me he'd slept in the train station. And it's like, it's an hour's drive. Like, that's not love. So there was like, I was starting to see things like this. And, my brothers and sisters were going hungry. But then, some other people who had founded this commune that we moved to, they were going out to restaurants. And it's like, this isn't right, This isn't right. So I was becoming more and more angry. And I was becoming, starting to rebel and, kind of speak up a little bit and trying, especially trying to defend my younger brothers and sisters where I could. But yeah, that's, got too much. But I think like the main reason I left was because it wasn't so much that I'd thought through every doctrine and rejected everything. It was this overwhelming feeling that I just cannot live like this anymore. Like I didn't want to have 9 children and just live this lifestyle of begging on the street and just feeling frustrated and angry and seeing all the stuff that was going on.
And at this point where you start to kind of show this rebellion, it's interesting because what a lot of families might do in that situation is send their child to something like the training camp, which by this point doesn't exist, and which you'd already been through when you weren't rebelling, when you were just kind of going through your day to day, where your only signs of rebellion, in air quotes, was your struggle with your mental health that was just not recognized or supported, and actually just exacerbated through the acts and the experiences that you had to endure in the religion. But they can't threaten you with something that you've already been through, or something that has been shut down by that point because of its abuse, which is just so similar to all of the troubled teen episodes that we've done on the show, and around the different wilderness and therapeutic boarding schools that exist in America and the rest of the world. So what can they do to you at this point? You know what it's like to travel around. You know what it's like to be separated from your family and from your parents. You know what it's like to live with no food and no money. So other than the ingrained repercussions you've been told about repeatedly since a young age around how your family will be affected if you leave and bad things will happen to them, apart from kind of that responsibility hanging over your head, there's not really much that they can do to keep you there.
Yeah, and the thing they did mostly was they would say that they needed to talk to me and bring me into a room and just rant at me for hours, and that was their thing that they did. Yeah, I guess that's all they had left at that point.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It sounds that way from what you've told us. And so from 96 to 2000, you just have 4 years of just growing more and more.
Yeah. I mean, that commune broke up maybe a year before I left, which is good, and that got a little bit easier. But even so, I knew I didn't want to stay.
And so you were the first of your family to leave, first of 9 children, first of your parents and anybody else. So how, when, and why did that happen? Can you talk us through your entire journey around that experience?
Yeah, I'll try to. It's leaving is probably one of the it is one of the hardest parts. So it's hard when things are hard. I struggle. I don't know. I still struggle to kind of get words out and speak. But what had happened was that we used to make occasional trips back to the West to do fundraising, because fundraising in Eastern Europe was quite difficult, and people didn't have a lot of money. They were just out of communism, so we used to do trips back to the West, and then on one of the trips back to the West, I met a guy who I'd lived with previously, and we'd always got on and stuff. But by this time I'm like 18, and he's grown up as well, and he really likes me, and so we kind of we keep in touch. And so he wants to leave, and he says, I'm going, do you want to come? And his family did a trip over to Eastern Europe for various different reasons, but I managed to get a lift back with them because they'd driven over. So I was able to hitch a lift back with them. And so that's how I left. So I left with him, and he helped me to leave, and his family helped me to leave. And initially they paid for everything, because Colt didn't give me a single penny when I left. I literally left with the clothes on my back and a few small belongings in a suitcase, and that was it.
Did you tell your family about your intentions?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, they knew. And they were pretty accepting, but also disappointed. And
Well, I suppose it's not just a matter of you saying I'm leaving. There's as you mentioned, the shunning process was something that was being practiced by that time. So your decision to leave probably came with a lot of subtext and unspoken meaning around what would then happen, and understanding that there might not be any contact between you and them for however long. You said you were the first of your family to leave, which kind of leaves me with some hope that there are other members of your family that have followed suit. And so you do maintain or have contact with at least some of them. But if you're leaving with just the clothes on your back, and your parents could move again in another week, 2 weeks or a month, there's a chance that even if you were to try and maintain contact with them, it wouldn't have been possible to.
That's right. And at the time they were planning a big move to Romania. So they were going even further, deeper inside the cult. So that's why I felt like I wouldn't see them, because, even if your parents felt like they would break the rules for you, if you're in a commune situation, they can't, because the other people in there would stop you from breaking the rules. So yeah, I can't say very much about how it is with my mum at that time, but it's a painful memory.
And you have this family friend who you reconnect with, and his family are supportive. They help you financially, they help you emotionally. I'm sure that through their own experience, they have a little bit of something to offer you in terms of what you need at that time. Perhaps they know that you need company. Perhaps they know that you need time. Or perhaps they know that you need to hear what it was like for them when they made the decision to leave.
No, I wouldn't say that. They were kind of halfway. They hadn't quite left yet. They were doing the bare minimum, not to be kicked out, but they were on their way out and they left shortly after.
Right.
So there was no, so he kind of left at the same time. But his process was a bit easier because he wasn't going to be shunned because his parents were in that leaving phase as well. But I mean, that's, I think, what made it really hard when I left was because me and him, we moved straight. They gave me a place to stay for a couple of months, and then me and him moved to a different part of the country together. And then it was just me and him. And yeah, there wasn't anyone that, there was no one else around. Like I literally knew nobody in England. And yeah, so there wasn't people that understood, and I had to, I had to fund my own way. Like right away, I had to find a job and, figure out what I was going to do. And so that, yeah, that was a really tough period.
But you found a job and you were able to support yourself. And we're talking sort of 21 years ago now from this initial decision to leave and the actions that you took following that decision to leave. So through that difficulty and through that pain, that confusion, that loneliness and that isolation, something was working, because you're here today speaking out about your experiences, highlighting some of the abuses that took place, and putting those experiences out on a public forum so that other people can become aware of the abuses that happened, and so that other survivors can feel validated in their own experiences. So something worked in those 21 years, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, underneath it all, there was some kind of survival instinct in there, So I did manage to, find a job, and, those early years, there was a lot of just, drinking and just whatever to try and forget. But also at the same time, I was managing to hold down a job, and, I managed to get myself into college in the evenings. So I was doing that. And that was the thing that, studying something was the thing that really pulled me through. I think at that, it gave me something to live for. Because my initial feeling was when I got out, it was just like, I left because I don't want to be inside, but then now I'm out. What do I have to live for? What's the point of it all? And that kind of just gave me something to, it was like little goals to reach.
And you went on to university and you got a degree.
I did, yes. And then I got a master's degree. Which was some...
Angela, that's incredible.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh my goodness, Angela, that you had a basic to non-existent education your entire life, and then you leave and you get a job and you go to college, at night college, so you can hold down a job, and then you go and you get a degree, and then you get a master's.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh my God, Angela, that's so incredible. Wow, I hope you realise what a huge accomplishment that is, and what a beacon of hope that must be for other survivors who have been through these similar experiences as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. What did you decide to practice in?
So I've done English literature.
Wow. And reading as well, like reading and writing and spelling and everything. And that's the path that you decide to take. Wow, that's so empowering. I feel like that's like a massive middle finger to the children of God.
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. And do you have any main inspirations or main literature loves?
Gosh, I really love stuff around. I love World War literature, but like not about the actual war, but about the people who lived, around those times and their identities. And it's funny, I never really knew why I was drawn to it until recently. But obviously, a lot of those people were living in a totalitarian regime as well, so maybe there was a bit of that going on. Yeah.
I just think that's amazing. I think that's so amazing. I mean, that I feel like I've had so many conversations lately where people have said, in the group we weren't allowed to play instruments, and now they like play in a band. Or people have said that in the group we weren't allowed to have secular reading material. It was only, the Bible or the propaganda that was provided that we were allowed to read, or a very strict reading list that had to be approved by leadership. And now you just love reading and just read all the time, whatever you want. It's usually always the Harry Potter series that people are like, I really wanted to read Harry Potter, but I was never allowed. But now you can just read what you want. I just think that's so fantastic. And you talked about how leaving was one of the hardest things, which speaks volumes when you consider the abuses and difficulties that you went through during your time in the Children of God, and how you had no choice because you were born into that movement. And of course, we rely on our primary caregivers or the shared caregivers in some environments and experiences. So there was no decision or way for you to do what you did really any earlier than you did it.
Yeah.
And I just think that's so incredible that you were able to just do that and take that power back for yourself, even though it was the most difficult thing that you've been through. You're able to sit here with us today and talk us through your story and show people that it's possible. It might be the hardest thing that you've ever done. It might take 21 years or maybe even longer than that to get to a place where you feel comfortable enough to explore and talk about your experiences and your feelings, and perhaps you never will speak about them in the capacity that we're having this discussion today. But if you make that decision to leave, even if you feel like it's impossible, like it will never work, even if you feel like it's too tough, or it's too lonely, or it's too isolating, or you have no idea where to start in terms of getting a job and getting money and being independent, you are just proof here right now that it is possible. And you haven't just left and got a job. You've found something that you're passionate about, something that you love, and you have just gone on to further education, and you've made those decisions for yourself, and you've enrolled into university, and you've enrolled into your master's degree, and you've done that for yourself. And I just think that that's so inspiring for other people that are listening who might be thinking, I don't know where to start, I'm not sure how to leave, or will it ever get easier, or how can I take steps to recover and to unravel all of the things that happened to me. And so that kind of leads us into my last question. Unless you have anything that you think is important to add, anything that I may have missed, I always just love to end on what advice you would give others who may be in a similar position and kind of wondering where they go next.
Yeah, definitely. And just before I say those points, that, I just want to make it really clear that although it was the hardest thing leaving, it was also the best thing that I ever did, and I found work that I love as well. I found work in the charity sector. So my life's become about helping other people who are struggling and having a hard time, even if it's, completely different struggles, but it's still about helping others. But my advice for people who are leaving or thinking about leaving or have just left, the first one is don't be alone. It's really important to find other people who understand, whether they are from the same group as you or from other groups. Things have changed a lot since I first left. There are support groups out there. The Family Survival Trust run a really great online support group. And there are others out there. I might just be making friends or finding a counsellor that specialises in cults that you feel comfortable talking to. And then the second thing I would say is, at some point when you're ready, it's really important to learn about cults and how they work, and to really come to an understanding about what has happened to you. And then the final thing is study. Like, it doesn't matter what, just find something that you love, whatever makes you happy. And, that stuff, it gets your brain working again after your cult has spent time shutting your brain down. And it's, for me, it was the ticket to my future. So I think it's really important.
And I think that's such an important thing to highlight, especially coming from the perspective of a second generation Children of God survivor, because as I kind of said before, you didn't have the decision, or you didn't make the decision to join this group, you were born into it. So it's not about reintegrating into life as you knew it or life as it is before you joined. It's about integration in the first place, learning what the secular world looks like and how it feels, and understanding the differences and how that might be traumatizing and triggering in itself. But to make sure that you're not alone, and to make sure that you research when you're ready, so that you can begin that understanding, unraveling and healing process, and to understand what happened to you, the methodologies that were used, to be able to apply actual universally identifiable terminology into those methodologies that are used in these groups, and the earmarks of cults, so that we can be guarded against them in the future if we ever find ourselves in vulnerable positions or situations. And then just to find something that you're passionate about and let yourself enjoy it as little or as much as you want to, just so you know what it feels like to take back some of that power and that autonomy, and to have a passion and something that makes you. That individualism can come through. You can explore yourself and your likes and your dislikes as much as you want to. And of course, get your brain working in a way that is separate to the cult language, cult speak, cult routines in terms of what time you wake up in the morning and what time you go to bed. Something that is completely separate from the movement that you were in, or even if it is something that was used in the movement, like music, like playing instruments, like chanting, like reading the Bible. You don't have to practice those things in the way that the group did it. You can find your own way to practice those things in a way that feels comfortable and empowering to you. So I think that those last bits of advice that you've just given are so powerful. And just you being here today and speaking out and offering people insight into your story is so powerful. Like you said, that in court, it was highlighted that there probably was abuse that happened in Newcastle and Scotland, but it's never been proven. You've come on here today on the record to say that there absolutely was. You have lived experience of those abuses that took place. And there could be other people that listen to this episode that also experienced those things in those locations or other places in the world that will know that they're not alone and will feel validated in their experiences and be able to say that happened to me as well, and I don't want to downplay it anymore. I don't want to pretend that it didn't happen. I don't want to not talk about it because it makes people uncomfortable because they don't understand it. And I just think that that's so incredible. So thank you so much for coming here with me this evening, Angela, for speaking to me in our same time zone, and for just offering people the opportunity to hear your experience in your own words.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
I'll speak to you soon, Angela. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too. Bye.
Take care. Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been The Cult Vault.